Welcome to episode 3 of the Bozi Breakdown. Tonight, we're getting into Texas, and with me, I have Joey Cohen. He's been all over the sport, all over NASCAR, even a little bit of sports car, everything from engineering cup cars to leading groups of engineers as a director and VP. Welcome, Joey.
Hey, thanks, Bozi. Thanks for having me tonight.
Appreciate you joining me to dig into some of the details. Let's jump right into it. I think that we saw a lot of action at Texas. I think there's been a lot of volatile opinions back and forth, and some of it probably has to do just with the width of the track.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Texas primarily has been a single groove racetrack, right? That you kind of consider. They've obviously, made efforts with PJ1 at times to try to enhance some racing lanes there. But what I saw Sunday was pretty promising. A lot of side by side racing, a lot of four wide restarts. A lot of really racy kind of activity there. Really good race. I think Texas, has gotten a bad rap, right, for the reconfiguration and some things. It's not been popular amongst some fans and some drivers, but overall, I think hit all the right elements and notes on Sunday. Whether that be the weather, and certain kind of grip levels that we're seeing, that kind of allowed for that type of racing. But I thought it was a really good product on Sunday, what you saw on the television.
Yeah, Texas is a pretty big challenge from a setup perspective, and you've seen this, working with various generations of Cup cars, but specifically you worked on the next gen car, and so the track has very different properties in turns 1 and 2 versus turns 3 and 4, and with the next gen car being limited with how the shocks can be set up with the actual physical limiters inside,
Mhm.
what are the trade-offs that you have to take when you're trying to go all out for performance there?
Yeah, to your point, you've got a racetrack that's got two totally different ends. You've got just that flat, long profile into 1 and 2. 3 and 4 is obviously a lot more kind of banked, heavily loaded, creating a lot of pace over there, line dependency over in 3 and 4. So really challenging to try to hit the balance and, kind of be good on both ends of the track. You definitely have to make some compromises. The track profile, as you're looking at your simulation, right, you're kind of looking at where your peak loads are going to be on your rear shock stops. You're going to see how hard can I, feel like I can get into the shock stops. A lot of those elements are dictated off the track profile, right? And how fast we think we're going, how we're going to load the vehicle. Another element people have to remember is that, they haven't been to Texas in a year. We go to Texas once a year on the circuit now. So the track that you kind of came and had a baseline for last year is not the same track. It's been weathered. It's been through the elements. I think they had a lot of snow in Texas last winter. Those are things that matter and change it changes the ground underneath the track. It changes how the bumps develop and what continues to kind of evolve over the racing surface. So yeah, we know that the two ends of the track are different and present different challenges for trying to balance the vehicle. But also you start to see some of those things like we saw on the race Sunday. Turn 4 exit seemed pretty treacherous, right, in a certain groove. And, you kind of saw the cars that were willing to take the chance to get aggressive with their rear shock limiters and get that attitude down. We know, it's well documented what getting the rear down does. It creates the most downforce. All of the downforce is generated from the underwing and feeding air to that rear diffuser. So it's a knife's edge, right? And it's a risk reward game. And you see some people that are rewarded for their decisions and some that, possibly took it a little too much risk, to try to make pace in the vehicle.
So, talking about that attitude for our viewers and listeners that might not
Mhm.
be aware, that's basically how the car is angled. So, the attitude, the go-to attitude with the next gen, where you want to make a bunch of downforce, is the nose of the car is pointing up, the rear is pointing down, and the goal there is to activate the rear diffuser. So, unlike
Yeah.
previous generations of the car, most of the downforce is made underneath the car versus over the car, and that
Yep.
affects everything from how the car handles on its own to also how the car handles with other cars around it. And I think we saw some differences there, in comparison to the Xfinity race or truck race, where you saw something, something different when trucks or cars came closer to each other versus in the Cup race.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's really hard to plan for, right? There's only one time a weekend that you're out there with 36 other race cars or 35 other race cars. You go through the practice sessions and you go through the qualifying session, and a lot of your simulation work is done around optimum settings of being out there in a single car kind of configuration. But yeah, these cars very aero sensitive in traffic. I think that's well documented with some of the feedback drivers give. How hard it is to pass at times, and there's some elements to that of why it's hard to pass, and how the air affects the trailing car because of that. It's not feeding maximum amount of air to that rear diffuser if there's a car in front of it. But yeah, a lot of influence in traffic, and the other series, to your point, they have a very sealed off mentality, right? They want to take their cars, they want to try to seal the valences, seal the splitters to the racing surface, create as much center of pressure on the outer body as possible. They don't want any of the air kind of dumping underneath the car. Really creating lift in their case, right? It's taking pressure, packing it under the car, and not allowing the pressure to distribute over the overbody of the car. So totally different mentalities. I think that's why you see a little bit of the different racing product, right? From Friday to Saturday to Sunday, just a different approach to how the performance gets created in the vehicle through aero properties.
And I think that's something that we saw, obviously saw a decent amount of cautions between both races with various types of incidents, but it all kind of goes back to the same properties, whether it's in the truck series where you see somebody, two trucks that are overlapping and one takes air away from the other and, it starts spinning, or, we're in the Cup series where you see an overlap with one car in front of the other and, it kills the air that's feeding to the diffuser. It's the same type of properties that are in play, just from different angles. And it all kind of boils down to you're trying to fit two cars into a space that's really could only fit one in the optimal like surface that you want to use. So
Yeah.
when and you have one taking downforce away from another. But then we also saw in the Cup Series incidents, partly due to how the cars are set up when they hit that bump.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you still see some of the, old habits die hard, right? And you still see some of those instances where they try to suck down on doors, pack air, things of that nature. Those tricks worked obviously in the Gen 6 car and previous iterations of the vehicles. You see it in the Xfinity series and the truck series all the time. Those guys are trying to understand, that there might be rookies in those series, not, trying to learn those kinds of lessons about how to pack air on people. But yeah, for the most part, right, side by side in the Cup Series, it takes a little bit of the outer body, the side force effect away from the other car, but it's not near as crucial to that vehicle. That vehicle doesn't rely on the over body aspects or some sort of yaw angle creation to keep its side force, keep its down force. It's hard to rob air from that vehicle. You have the Truck Series too, right? They're obviously on a different motor configuration. They have a lot of throttle time. A ton of downforce too, probably the most out of all the series. Actually, the most out of all the series for sure. So yeah, those cars are heavily dependent on getting their air to all the places they need to on the overbody, and I think you saw a lot of instances on Friday night of a lot of trucks get sucked around with somebody to their outside, right? And it's hard to carry that throttle, when you don't have near the amount of downforce or side force that you had the lap before. But yeah, it's really interesting to see for fans that are kind of trying to understand the different elements of, why the race on Saturday looks different than the race on Sunday. A lot of that can be explained by the stuff you're talking about here, and how the car reacts in traffic, or how it is affected by other cars in the field.
Yeah, and I think the one of the coolest things for me in the trucks that is the fact that they still have some sheet metal there. So we
Yeah.
still get to see some of these creations with the way the bodies are placed on the trucks, because they still, they obviously have rules where things have to fit, but
Sure.
they still have some play with how they tweak these things, and it's all like it still very much seems like artwork with the way these,
Yes.
body hangers work on this stuff versus in the Cup Series, and to an extent in the Xfinity Series, you just kind of bolt it on where it is because you have spec composite panels.
Yeah, and I mean, like, right, in a Cup car and an Xfinity car, even an Xfinity car, they're going through the optical scanner every week. They're going and being, held tolerances across the whole surface of the vehicle. Like you said, there's still some creativity. There's some areas between kind of where the inspection is done on the Truck Series where there's a lot of character built into those cars. There's some decisions you can make. The Truck Series, I can tell you, on like an intermediate track, there's a lot of decisions to be made. There's some teams that decide to trim their cars out, right? They decide that they don't need that. They want to create pace. have more speed in the vehicle by trimming out some of the characteristics that would create that rear downforce or side force. And you sometimes see guys, trimmed out, they qualify really well, right? But then the next thing you know, when they get 2 or 3 back in traffic, right, they drop the parachute, like the the truck is undrivable. And that's a lot of the decisions they get to make, right, is they can build a truck to have a lot of downforce in it. It's probably not going to qualify well, right? It's going to be back there in the 15th to 20th range when you look at the truck series. But I think you saw some guys on Friday that were able to drive themselves to the front because they just had more grip and more aero abilities of their truck in the race conditions.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, talking about the way the inspection works. So with the Xfinity and Cup, you have the Hawkeye optical scanning station, which are cameras and projectors that record an image that is very, very accurate across the whole surface of the body.
Mm-hmm.
But the truck series still uses an old school inspection method because they have these large aluminum templates.
Handheld
And
templates,
there's yeah, so it's these pieces that fit over the body, but they're not scanning down to 1/100th of an inch, or I think it's 0.0150, I think is the tolerance for the OSS, something to that effect.
Yeah, it's down to 100 now, but
yeah,
100 thousandths of an inch. Yeah.
So it's very, very small, and the trucks are kind of, if it fits the template, it fits the template.
Yeah, and we'll work it with you a little bit, right? We'll rock it a little bit this way, that way, but yeah. I mean, and definitely, it's different. It's those teams obviously don't have the resources Cup teams have, right? So it's an effort by NASCAR to kind of level the playing field and make it possible for those teams to show up to the racetrack and not to have to incur these large investments that the higher up series have to. There's still a purist element of that kind of racing, which is kind of cool.
It makes it kind of fun, and seeing fabricators do some of that stuff is still fun. Even though I came up in sports cars where everything's kind of carbon composite, and at least in my day and age, maybe back in the 80s, 90s, it might not have been that way. It's always cool to see some of the stuff getting fabricated, and somebody turning a piece of sheet metal into something, and you go to the track, and you just you see the rear end sticking on, and you're like, oh, okay, that's where the idea is, and like that's what that's what you guys were chasing, and you see it. It's all it's all done just very like purposely and like very, and it follows a very, very unique pattern. So it's cool to see some of that in action, but it's also shows how different the racing is from series to series. But even with all that said, everybody still kind of had their own excitement and also had their own incidents. And one of the things that I think, to kind of circle back to the beginning, is important is what the drivers kind of have to withstand if they want the car to perform in the Cup Series, going back to those shocks and those stops. And you mentioned that, there's decisions to be made, and often that means that the car is riding on those stops inside the shock. So what exactly does that mean? What does that look like, and what does the driver feel?
Yeah, I mean, what you're basing your simulation obviously gives you an idea of how on the limit you are in those areas, right? Like you said, you've got a lot of elements that are feeding into that tool, the track profile, the tire model, right? How is the tire going to absorb some of those bumps, some of that track profile? How is it going to absorb some of the setup decisions I made in the rear, what my rear springs were, things like that, but, really that's an exercise in the driver's comfort or tolerance of being on those stops. Some of the guys, it doesn't bother them at all. Some of them are highly sensitive to it. They feel it, jarring their back all the way through the seat. It's just a very rough ride, in certain scenarios on certain racetracks, being on those limiters, those internal stops hard. You're talking about a spring that has infinite rate, right? It's the stiffest thing you could possibly create by sitting on that internal stop. And it can sneak up on you, right? You could be running a certain line on the racetrack that you hadn't run all day, a position you've been put yourself into. You could carry more throttle, kind of dive it down into the corner a little bit harder and put your car in a position of load that it hadn't seen all day. I think that's what you see, that it catches drivers by surprise at times, because, I didn't feel that last lap. And we heard that a lot out of a driver, hey, it just came around on me out of nowhere. And that's 100% just the product of, just hitting the internal limiter at an instantaneous point. You've got an 18-inch tire that's got a short sidewall. There's not a lot of deformation that occurs, a lot of saturation that can occur in that tire to allow for that hard stop contact, to allow you a little bit more forgiveness. So really, those guys are on a knife's edge every lap and every decision they make with the vehicle. Obviously it's the forbidden fruit, right? The lower you can get the vehicle, the more downforce you're going to make, right? And that should equate to speed. So really, you're looking at what kind of challenges the track poses to you on that race weekend, and then what the driver's tolerance is for being able to kind of ride on those stops.
And that's kind of, I think in the past you've described it as kind of just hitting a big pothole. Is the closest streetcar equivalent that you can think
Yeah.
of, is because there's just a huge unexpected bump. But then if you find a line that works, that has these bumps, occasionally you might be going lap after lap, every lap, like feeling these impacts, right? So it's
Yeah.
there's a lot of tolerance that these drivers have to have. And when you said the kind of weathering of the track and all these things that impact it, is you might have a piece of pavement that starts to sink a little bit somewhere,
Yeah.
and then you feel every little bit like of the track when you're like on those stops.
Yeah. I mean, it can really take you by surprise. You can unload a certain place on Friday or Saturday, and you'll find out real fast what's changed, or where your car's at in relation to some of those things. But yeah, I mean, like, pace degradation, right? You obviously plan on, the most load your car's going to see is when it's turning its fastest lap. And I mean, even there's times in, you have to take in all these predictive elements, right? Like, hey, I'm going to elevate my tire pressures for qualifying, but what does that mean for the height of my car? Can I afford to lower it back down to account for some of those tire pressure increases or decisions I'm going to make on the car going into qualifying? I know I'm going to run my fastest lap of the weekend, hopefully right here in this qualifying session, but you're not only making decisions about how am I going to adjust my tire pressures for qualifying. Now I got to figure out how to get my heights back to where they need to be to get back to the downforce profile that I was just kind of running at attitude wise. So everything is centered around that, right? All your decisions that are made are solely, centered around that activity and that attitude of the vehicle, and that's really what can make or break your whole weekend.
You're kind of freezing your diffuser in place and then trying to make everything fit on
Yeah,
top of it and around it. Like
yeah,
that's kind of the main goal. And I think that's another good point that you mentioned, tires and tire pressure. We've seen in the past where uh, teams will do a pit stop, and the guy will go riding around, and then 4 or 5 laps later we'll see an unexpected flat tire.
yeah.
And I think that's a good example of all these pieces fitting together, because what exactly are they doing there when that happens?
Yeah, again, I call it forbidden fruit, right? That the lower I can get my tire pressures, right, it's lowering the vehicle, right? Same exercise, right? But I'm not, necessarily having to use the suspension or the internal stop as the mechanism of lowering it, right? I can do that with just the pressure of the tire, essentially removing spring rate from the back of the vehicle by taking that air pressure out of the tire. But again, Goodyear makes tires at a certain recommended pressure. They tell you that because they know the failure rate, and they've seen the testing and what can occur at certain inflation pressures. But man, it's hard not to tell yourself to go grab that little bit of speed. It's not a little bit either. It's a lot of times it's pretty significant pace to really get those tire pressures down. But again, it's a juggling act between the balance of the vehicle, right? And I mean, we're sitting here talking about, right, the internal stops and things like that. The other thing we want to balance out, right, is we don't want to wear material off the rear diffuser, right? We don't just want to get, so even if we're comfortable running super hard on the internal stops, I think you see that white dust, that kind of burst that comes out of the back of the car at times on some rougher tracks or some places where they're really low. Yeah, that's just wearing material off the diffuser skirts. And the less material you have, I mean, you're taking a portion of the side force and aero elements away from the ability of the rear to have those strakes out there acting as an aero benefit. So, same reason why we're so particular about flat tires, right? Because all we're doing is killing the underwing of the car. So yeah, obviously we're talking about stops here, but you also want to consider that, hey, there's a point of no return as well on the diffuser strakes and things of that nature, where I don't want to give up material and some aspects there that are helping me out.
It's a big balancing act, and that's once you start wearing the diffuser down, it's like you're doing exactly the opposite, because you're wearing material away, you're taking the diffuser further away from the track and killing
Yep.
that downforce. And that flat tire is such a big thing to balance, because Goodyear may say, hey, we want you to run at this pressure, but you might try to run it a few psi below what they recommend, and that puts strain on the sidewall of the tire.
Mm-hmm.
And combined with those bumps, just imagine you have this aluminum wheel that's bumping a folded over piece of rubber. Eventually
Mm-hmm.
things will fracture, and then but it's like a whole, it's just like that puzzle, just like the rest of the car, of like, hey, we're moving with these pieces back and forth, and you could create a big mess very quickly if you push that edge.
For sure. I think it's like it's kind of like the analogy, right? The car's always the fastest right before the motor blows. It's like car's probably the fastest it'll ever be right before the tire blows. So I think it's a lot of
That's
commonality there.
well, and I think that's a good segue into one of the other questions that's been brought my way. Is we saw Denny Hamlin exit the race pretty early. TV obviously mentioned that they saw some oil, but I think he probably maybe had that experience for a bit, because I went back to look at some of the footage, and I saw that right before we saw the fire show, the headers were just glowing red.
Yeah.
And that could be for a variety of reasons, but often that means that there's likely a lack of fuel compared to how much air the engine's getting in that moment. So it's running lean, and then the next thing we see is this fireball. So we see the side of the car becomes like a flamethrower, and there's good reason for that, because there's some pieces in there that are doing something else but become flamethrowers in some of these incidents.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of, it's very, it's not unlikely, but it's highly unlikely that, there's smoke before there's fire. Typically, a lot of the time, so when these things are kind of going south and what's going to kind of happen. There's a difference of opinions, right? Do I just, I've seen guys finish the race on 7 cylinders, right? You've seen, where they're trying to
Well,
continue yeah, there was not 7 cylinders left in that one though.
we saw Cletus McFarland in the ARCA race. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
he was running 7 of 8 for like the last half of the race and finished in the top 10. So I
Yeah,
mean
he was being carried by bald eagles or something.
yeah.
That's what he said, right? Bald eagles were carrying
Yeah,
him. Yeah.
yeah. He's very big on the bald eagles. I like his approach, but that's the thing, is like you never know. And I think Denny said on the radio is a couple of laps before it went, he's like, I feel the tone of the engine change.
Mhm.
So the car is still moving, but he has enough experience to know, like, hey, something doesn't feel right. And then
Yeah,
he made
something's
it a
preparing
lap.
for
I mean, I
rapid
think a lap and a
evacuation.
half, and it all went up. But
Yeah.
one of the things that we have, which is a safety measure, is we have ductwork that leads to those rockers.
Yeah.
What's the point of that ductwork there? That
Yeah, so I mean the prior generations of the next gen car, a lot of people may not be familiar. The exhaust used to run the full length of the rocker panel, so we used to exit the exhaust in front of the rear tires. What we come to find out there was, right, those exhaust pipes, those pipes under the driver, were carrying a large amount of heat and just heat soaking that underside of the chassis. Basically cooking the drivers, right? High cockpit temperatures, things that were pretty uncomfortable at the beginning of the next gen era. Credit to NASCAR, right? They typically have a good way of addressing and version changing some items on the vehicle to not only improve safety and other aspects, right? But essentially now the exhaust diffuses right there behind the front tires. It's a very short exhaust from the headers and the collectors there off the engine. So there is a lot of centralized heat still there, right? You've still got a lot of components that are running near composite panels, some things that are very flammable, obviously, right? When they do get hot enough or they get some sort of igniter put on them. In this case, probably looking at some engine fluids, right? That help that cause a little bit, but it's not out of the ordinary for that space underneath the car there to be well over 350 degrees, especially a moderately warm day at Texas, right?
Yeah.
You've kind of got the vehicle, like you said, you're trying to get it as close to the earth as possible. The underwing is fully encapsulating the underside of the car, right? Not a lot of air moving through the vehicle to kind of cool things. So NASCAR has to electively, right, create these ducts that will channel and force air to those areas of the car to kind of keep air moving across of them. Fire and oxygen, though, obviously, it'll feed a fire pretty quick too. So, but no.
But
It was a pretty cool shot. I mean, it looked like
yeah.
CGI of the car just going around there, kind of pitched sideways in flames. So.
Yeah, and and the part of the reason why it was probably pitched sideways so quickly is if it dumped some fluids,
Sure.
they've air forced them out through those pieces of the rocker and then just dumped them in front of the tire. So
Yep. Yeah.
you quickly get fluids on the tire as well. But that's basically, I think, why it looked so dramatic is you have
Sure.
all this ductwork at the front of the car that's forcing air, and if you have a little flame, it quickly becomes a big flame.
Big one. Yeah.
As anybody's experienced, if you try to fan a campfire,
Yeah.
same type of scenario there.
Yeah.
But that leads me into another thing is we saw Denny's now going to kind of have to qualify at the beginning of the pack at Kansas, and we saw Joey Logano have to do the same and work his way forward.
Yeah.
But one of the big disadvantages of having an early exit is that the formula now puts you as one of the first people to qualify. So
yeah,
then he's going to have an uphill battle.
For sure. That can sometimes take you weeks to dig out of, right? There's a lot of elements that go into a race weekend and how you're going to be competitive and how you're going to gain track position and how you're going to have a great weekend. That starts at the week prior, right? It starts with all your metrics, how the qualifying draw is going to be, an early exit from the race, like you said, is going to guarantee you an early draw for the next week's qualifying session. And look, we see it time and time again, right? As the track continues to get more heat in it, in these qualifying sessions, we go faster and faster. It's no coincidence, right, that obviously some of the better cars are obviously some of the last ones to go, but you are giving up a pretty big advantage by going out early in the session, and cars continue to get faster and faster. NASCAR's even adjusted some of the rules about how the lineup was made, right? Because we saw so many, kind of inequalities with where, hey, if I was in Group A versus Group B, that would kind of ruin the starting lineup, based off the track conditions. A place like Richmond, right? Super sensitive, depending on what group you're in. But yeah, to your point, it can take weeks to dig out of that, right? And then that's an element that's going to determine, if you don't qualify well, you don't get a good pit stall. And if you don't get a good pit stall, then you've got a challenge in the race on Sunday to try to manage who you're pitting around. Are they blocking you in? Are they making your day more difficult than it needs to be? Those positions on pit road are invaluable, right? You see a lot of the race and the track position determined by how you come on and off pit road. So yeah, 100%. It takes a full clean sheet effort to have a good race weekend. But I think you point to a great element of, guys did qualify fairly poor and were able to make it up to the front of the field, right? For as much criticism as we get about not being able to pass or not see a change in the running order or things of that nature, especially what we deemed Texas being a single lane track, right? I think we saw some guys, I don't have the exact stat, but, I think it was a good bit of the top 10 cars came from starting positions that you wouldn't have considered favorable in the lineup. So
yeah, Chastain started 32nd, I believe. So
yeah,
he made up 30 spots in the race. And obviously there was some attrition, but a lot of that was like just on raw pace. And that's he made some comments, that his car, he didn't like his car, and I can't remember exactly the comments he made like in qualifying. And I think across the, kind of range of all those trackhouse cars that didn't, come off the truck well and who didn't qualify well. But obviously they figured out some stuff during the race. How does that process like typically play out?
Yeah, I mean, Next Gen, even since the beginning, has been super interesting kind of study in how your race goes, right? And you find out very quick during that first run of the race how your balance is, and typically a lot of the times it will be different than what you experienced on Saturday, like we talked about, for the sheer fact that you're now in a pack of 35 other cars. Your aero is being much more disturbed. Obviously, if you didn't qualify well, you have probably the worst air on your car out of any vehicle on the racetrack. You don't have that clean air to the front, of the vehicle. So yeah, I mean, the first run of the race can be highly unpredictable, and really you're looking, try to manage your day, stay on the lead lap. That's the biggest probably target for the first stage, is like just manage yourself to where you can get to the first caution, the first pit stop, and make pretty significant adjustments. I think we've seen at times guys go under the hoods, right? Adjust the front rounds, adjust the rear rounds, try to get the attitude where they need in traffic. They kind of get pictures. These guys get all sorts of data on the pit box, right? They have real-time photos, real-time video analysis of where the car is riding in traffic, where it is on the racetrack, that they're kind of dissecting through, and they can make adjustments based off that. But yeah, to your point, the Chastain example, I think it's a guy that says his car's broken, the first run of the race, to where they aggressively have to work on it, and they end up getting it right, so credit to those guys. They've got tools to figure out the adjustments on the car, the things that it needs. Obviously, the driver's a big part of that. His feedback and what he was telling them obviously was directing them down a path that was beneficial, it seems, and it's what he needed to create pace. So, credit to those guys. Those cup races are long races for a reason. Your day's not over till it's over. So, those guys took their opportunities to work on it, stayed in the game, and they were rewarded for that at the end of the day.
And I think it was doubly impressive because not only did they have all that to battle through, they also had some pit lane issues. I was
Mm-hmm.
watching the onboard of one of the stops, and he came in, and when they came around the left side, I saw the changer just stop looking at the jackman, and
Mm-hmm.
Shane Wilson, who's the jackman, reacted very quickly. It looks like either the jack malfunctioned or something broke,
Yep.
because he just grabbed over the wall, grabbed the spare, and was able to get the car up and get the tire swapped. And obviously, it wasn't a fast pit stop, but it also wasn't a complete disaster. And that's
Mm-hmm.
going back to all those little pieces, is every single piece matters, especially when track position is so important. But even with that, where they probably lost 6 or 8 spots with that delay there of replacing the jack, he was still able to battle back twice during the
Yeah.
race. So it was fascinating to watch, like how he was able to march forward.
Yeah, and people don't get to see a lot of that on TV, right? Not only the pit stop, right? You get to see the pit stop, right? But those guys essentially have spares of everything behind the wall, and they are particular about where it's placed, where it's within reach of them. They know exactly where to go and get that tool or what they need when they fail a jack or a gun, things of that nature. It's not by happenstance that these guys just reach over the wall and there's something there for them. That's a very well coordinated plan. These teams go to high levels of details to account for everything within a race weekend. I can even, there's some well documented aspects of lugs getting stuck on cars, right? Well, every team made adjustments for that and have a piece of equipment behind the wall now that makes it capable for them to take the wheel off if it gets over tightened, things like that, that, they always have a plan for. And to your point, it can make the difference in a good day or a bad day, right? You get out there and lose a bunch of positions, get towards the back of the field. Well, next thing you know, you're caught up in the next wreck. And you weren't caught up in that wreck because you were racing with those guys. You were caught up in that wreck because you had a bad pit stop and you lost positions on pit road. And then you were in the wreck. So, a lot of details, a lot of things go into the planning and execution in all areas of a race weekend. And that's definitely an area that's been very critical in the next gen era, is pit road. And your performance on pit road during the day can decide a lot of factors.
Yeah, it's everybody's trying to find tweaks and heavily guarding their stuff, but we've also seen pit stops just continue to get faster and faster because of it, because it seems like it's been much easier to gain a tenth or two on a pit lane with technique or finding a different type of athlete or something else
Yeah.
versus trying to tweak all that stuff that's in a very, very enclosed box on the car itself to get the tenth or two there.
Yeah, and I mean that's why you see so much effort being put into that area, especially in next gen, right? We've got teams that they don't allow their teams to pit five load cars, right? Because they don't feel like the mechanics and the hand eye coordination and those elements don't favor anything on Sundays, right? For a single lug change. So yeah, a lot of decisions get made that are wholly for the performance of next gen cup teams and their performance on Sundays.
Yeah, there's quite a few that just pit one lug, and I think the leading crews, at least this season, are single leg only. So that
Yep.
that tracks. But and that kind of brings me back to one of our original points. Just to get into a little bit more of the underbody and a very, very hot topic on social media of whenever there's any type of racing that somebody doesn't like a specific aspect, people the first comment is take the underbody off. And that's and that's in my explanation, or I've stopped trying to explain it to a lot of people because a lot of people just see the diffuser and they don't
Yeah.
understand, or some people don't even know what the diffuser is. They've just heard the word.
Yeah.
But as a theoretical exercise here, what would happen if we just pull the diffuser off this car and put a flat panel there?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of smart people that have done a lot of work in this area. It's like, I don't know the extremes examples you could use, but it's like watching an F1 race and saying, I don't like the way they race. Pull the front and rear wing off of it, right?
Yeah.
Pull every mechanism off there that was designed on the car, right, to provide the performance of the vehicle. The underwing is not solely to blame for what is and isn't good racing or performance. There's a lot of different elements that go into the aspect of a race weekend. Certainly, the car is not going to flip upside down, right? If you take the underwing off, it's not an extreme kind of case that you're concerned with, but it is going to change the characteristics of the car significantly because the symmetric outer body offers no sort of mechanism for putting downforce in the car. There's no sort of things that we've had in previous iterations of vehicles. Long rear quarter panels, big bumper offsets, big tail offset, greenhouses put in different skewed positions, changing windshield angles, changing nose lead, things like that. That, like you said, there was a time period where it's well documented, the social media pictures of the banana cars or
Yeah.
whatever. Those cars were purpose
Yeah.
built,
The
right?
Twisted Sisters. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those cars were purpose built to make left-hand turns, and that's what they did. And there's not a lot of elements in the rear suspension to create a lot of mechanical skew in the vehicle either. There's some pretty fixed elements back there, geometry wise, that are not allowing that as well too. So really, you're looking at what entails, a majority of the downforce creation on the vehicle, and we can't just say let's take that off. I certainly, I think people kind of pine for a time that they don't, remember too well. And look, we can watch those old races where the cars were, 8 inches off the ground, bouncing around and, kind of moving all over the place. But I mean, there was probably a lot of races that didn't have as close of a finish or near as much side by side action as we had this past weekend. So yeah, I think, look, there's no one fixed solution. There's no one stop answer in this whole thing. It's a collection of a lot of elements of the vehicle. And a lot of that deals with, we've seen races just out of sheer track conditions, temperature of the race weekend, right? Like,
Yeah. Bristol. Yeah.
when is somebody going to yell at God for not giving us the right weather? So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of what it boils down to. It's
Sure. Yeah.
not really an element that you can point to a single thing of let's take the diffusers off. So,
Yeah, and that's kind of the point that I always try to get across is that you could theoretically take a piece off and have this very unexpected behavior. But going back to our original discussion of these pieces are so finely tuned to one another, now imagine you take a big chunk out of it. Like you're
yeah.
not only not only would you have to like figure out how you're going to control the car, but you would likely have to redesign the entire car basically to just try to get one of those elements you mentioned, whether that's to make the quarter panels longer or make them offset somehow. Like you would
Sure.
have to like change the entire theory of the car in order
Yeah.
to just get a little bit of downforce back, maybe not even like what you're getting there. So I think that's like, part of the deal there is I think people just maybe just don't have like a grasp of like everything that's involved in these cars making downforce and making speed in general.
Yeah, it's not a one for one trade off, right? Like you can't just remove something and it, all of a sudden be equivalent or some sort of representative change of like, okay, this is where the vehicle needs to be now. It takes like I said, we've done tests, right? We went to Phoenix and we've taken portions of the underwing off. We've been to different tests, and NASCAR's done their fair share of work in the wind tunnel and CFD analysis of what's the result of something like this, and there's a reason why there's not these large blanket changes made, right? Because it's not reinforced in being a direction that would be trying to accomplish what everybody thinks it's trying to accomplish. There's a lot of elements and details that go into these cars, and like you said, it's a waterfall and trickle effect of you can't just change one thing and that be the solution. One change is going to affect 15 other things and 15 other variables on the vehicle look, I mean, I think that to me kind of creates a perfect kind of example of, well, let's just run the all-star race with whatever you think needs to be on the car.
Yeah.
And what is going to be said when one car laps the field, because they I mean, that's really what you're looking at. The law of averages is somebody's going to hit on something extremely well and pace the field by 20 seconds, or have an insane lead, right? It's not going to guarantee, just because everybody got to do what they wanted to do, that there's going to be this door banging side by side great racing. So
No, that is a good point. I think that I think a lot of fans, when they look at this and look at some of the stuff that gets mentioned just from the surface, they they immediately come to the realization that downforce bad or whatever, and that's looking at it from the perspective of an entire race. But if you give teams the ability to tweak their cars for whatever they want, they're going to pile on more
yeah,
downforce.
yeah.
So it's you're getting exactly the opposite. Like you would have disparity in the field, but would fans actually want that? That's
Yeah, I
kind of the
mean,
question there.
yeah, I mean, we went through the same thing of trying to bolt things to the outer body, putting dive planes on the nose and putting dive planes on the rear fenders. And certainly, yeah, that can work, right? But NASCAR, we kind of pride ourselves on close racing and kind of a little bit of contact, right? So the first little bit of this or that side by side racing, and next thing you know, you've got outer body pieces scattered on the track and creating debris cautions, and next thing you know, I don't have a piece on my car that makes 100 counts of downforce. Am I allowed to come back in and replace that? Can I put another
Yeah,
one on? Or just opens up a lot of elements to the
yeah.
race that I don't think we want to see over officiated. We don't want to see things having to be explained in that manner as the race is going on.
And I think that's probably a good point because even like in my experience on the IMSA side, we frequently lose dive planes
Yeah.
because racing has and IMSA I think kind of mirrors NASCAR a lot
NASCAR
with
now.
like the style. Yeah, I mean it's same parent company and a lot of the
Yep.
people cross over, but we see that frequently. I would say probably once every 3 races the car comes back missing at least one dive plane just
Yep.
because you get towards the end of the race, you're beating and banging, and you have that piece, that's there at the front, and somebody else has theirs, and whoever hits at the right angle, you lose it. And in
Yeah.
NASCAR, that's probably a guarantee for almost every race. Like if you're,
Sure.
because you see these tire marks on, and things on the
Yeah.
body panels,
Martinsville.
and
Yeah.
yeah, 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 and you're going to lose this. So adding
Yeah.
stuff like that, like it was cool to see it on something like the Garage 56 car, but I
Hmm.
don't think anything being bolted on, especially to the sides of the car, is really a feasible option to have something that's effective.
Yeah. I mean, no, I mean, I think again, intermediates, we've seen some of the best racing I think we've seen in the last, 10, 15 years in NASCAR. Texas being this past weekend. One of them, we're coming up on a pretty good range of races here. Kansas, phenomenal race. Charlotte coming up at the end of the month, the 600. There's people crying for us to return to the oval at Charlotte 2 times a year now, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, that's big
and
change, yeah, from
big
from a few
change,
years
right?
ago.
And yeah, from a few years ago, and that's a product of this car. And certainly they will get the short track package right at some point, and have a lot of confidence and faith. There's a lot of smart people that work on it, but it'll eventually be right. But I think we have to sometimes pause and be careful what we wish for in the
Yeah.
scope of like what we should be doing to these cars.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think a lot of it also just comes down to the presentation. I
Hmm.
think a lot of what's shown on TV and how they produce this stuff is it's it's still geared towards how the old car raced, and
Hmm.
how a lot of that's, even I know it's been multiple years, but I think a lot of the production is geared towards that, and the storylines that develop are ones based on that. And I mentioned this. I can't remember which race it was, but it was a race. I think it might have been at Martinsville or somewhere else. But I saw, sitting in the infield, I saw a completely different story than what I saw when I was from people that were watching from home on social media, because I could see all these different things developing, and people like that they were gonna make these moves and come through the field. And I think that's a big impact of it is just maybe taking a different approach. And I understand that TV has to figure out all these things and put them together into one cohesive story. But I think
Hmm.
a lot of it also has to do just with how the story is being told, and like what's being followed in the race.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very fortunate, right? I mean, people say, we only see the front of the field in a lot of these races. Well, there's been a lot of action at the front of the field, right? There's been lead changes and passing up towards the front, guys, comers and goers. Yeah, but to your point, right? Being at a racetrack, you can look anywhere through the field, and there's some sort of battle going on. And the Cup Series is probably at its highest competitive level that it's been in its history. There's no slouches in that field, right? The race for 25th and 26th is a legitimate hard fought race. And there's not a guy just riding back there in that position. Just there's no laps. We had a discussion with somebody this week about how you used to ride the first 100 laps of the race, or the first 200 laps, or just wave somebody by. And like we talked about earlier, there's no waving people by right now. There's defensive maneuvers and blocks being had, because they know that one position of track position, how much it matters in this day and age in this car. And if you let one person under you, then next thing you know, there's another guy there peeking to take the position from you, and one turns into 5 positions. And that's a big deal, right? There's none of this waving people by culture anymore in the Cup Series, which I think is cool, hyper competitive, right? And that's what you want to see.
No, absolutely. I mean, gone are the days of starting parks and things like that. And I think
Yeah.
that also, goes back to the nature of the cup car and the level of these drivers and them adapting to the way the car drives and the tools that are available. And, they've learned that this car, because it relies on the underbody so much, that they can't use some of the stuff they used, with the previous generation car and some of the other series with side force, and just basically, like you said, sucking up on the door or whatever else to kind of affect another car. But they figured out that, hey, I know that what happens to my diffuser if it gets choked of air. So
Hmm.
now I'm going to get in front of you. And I mean, that's, no matter what you do with the car, if they know that this potential exists, the drivers that are most skilled are going to use it to their advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I look at a perfect example this weekend. Carson Hocevar gets his first Cup pole, right? But there's a guy who went straight from the Truck Series to the Cup Series, never spent any kind of quantifiable time in the Xfinity Series, right? So has no recollection or understanding of how an Xfinity car drives, right, or what the characteristics of that vehicle are. And so, I got to spend a little time around him in the 2023 season. And, his philosophy was like, this car wants to be driven hard, right? Like if I let off the gas in the entry of the turn, well, then the car's lifting up, right? The diffuser's coming up. So when I feel that moment of the car getting unsettled, I have to drive it in harder. I have to keep everything loaded. And he just, went with that philosophy of I have to drive the car how it wants to be driven, right? It's not me wanting the car to drive a way I want it to drive, or, and I think that's a lot of the mentality of, some of the guys, credit to guys like Denny and some of these other veterans, right? They've adapted through multiple generations of what is the Cup car, right? And I'd say this one is probably by far the hardest to adapt to, in the sport, in the history of what generations of Cup cars we've had.
That makes sense. And now that you mentioned Carson, it makes me think that the jump from trucks to the Cup car might have been especially beneficial at Texas, just because of the nature of how the trucks drive, where
Yep.
you're on the throttle for so much. So if
Hmm.
you've programmed your mind to just be on the throttle, that could actually explain why, he was able to kind of eke out that little bit more than, say, McDowell, and even in qualifying here,
Yeah.
because he's learned that downforce in the truck, is built into it basically. But in the Cup
Yeah.
car, you got to put it under load to kind of set the
Load the
diffuser down.
diffuser.
So
Yep.
that's interesting. That just kind of clicked as you were talking about that. I was like, yeah, that makes sense, because now he's using the same behavior in the truck, which a lot of Cup veterans may not trust because
Sure.
they know that they think that they're going to go overboard, where he's comfortable because that's what he's used to driving in the trucks. And then he's tried it in the Cup car and it worked. So now he's just pushing more and more. That's
Yeah.
that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, look, there's no substitute for track time either, right? Like, he got to feel all the undulations of the track. He got to understand where the bumps were, right? Not the same suspension, not the same ride quality, right, that the truck has, but he probably put that in his mind for, the first lap he's got to fire off on Saturday. He's got some familiarity with the track. And I think it's cool, right? We're seeing a desire out of all these guys to go back and race in the lower series. I mean, a lot of activity in the truck series, to your point.
Oh yeah.
We've got guys like Larson, Byron, Hocevar. There's been a good range of Cup drivers in the lower series this year. Specifically the truck series. We only used to see Kyle, come down there and kind of race in the truck series. And now we've had a wide range of Cup guys just come down there and want to get track time. So I think it's really cool.
No, it's neat. And the trucks for me are very, very neat, just because of
Yeah.
the nature of how those bodies are done. And it's just such a cool series to watch. And they just have such cool racing. Like, I think one of my things that I'm looking forward to is seeing, how stuff like, some of the new tracks that they go to. I think trucks are going to Lime Rock, so
Yep.
an
Like a
interesting thing, because
short track road course.
yeah, no, and it's like the best combination of stuff. Because one of the things that I do like about, kind of that type of stock car is when you put it on a road course, it looks like, it's not supposed to be there, but
Yeah.
because of that, it just looks so much fun,
Yeah. Those
because
guys hustle those trucks around.
yeah, you have
I
to
can
do all
remember.
these things.
Yeah, I mean, some of the best races, Canadian Tire Motorsports Park, up there in Canada. Just like a rhythm course, like a little bit of elevation change, but yeah, they looked out of control every corner, just slinging the thing around, and yeah, just manhandling those things, and yeah, they're fun to watch trucks on the road courses, and some of those other things.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. Well, I appreciate you joining me. This was fun and cool to expand on some of the concepts here. What you got? Anything fun that you're working on or looking forward to this weekend or in the next few weeks?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things, yeah, around racing for sure. I don't envy you at all. Every time I see you on Twitter, have to, I feel like you're the Bob Pockris of the technical side of the world, having to break down everything. You do an excellent job of it. Really brings a lot of great insight to the fans and the technical side that we need. To excite the next generation of fans and help them get a deeper passion for the sport, right? And take them below the surface layer of what the sport really is. So yeah, I'm probably just going to be a guy checking out what kind of stuff you got going on X during the weekend. What's going on? See who's trying to break the rules or see why they're trying to do it. Things like that. That stuff's kind of fun for me, but no, got a lot of exciting things in the works, and really, really excited. Just like anything, right? We're racers, we go race, and so that's what we'll do.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'll be doing a little bit of both this weekend. I was actually telling my editor at motorsport.com today that I'm gonna have to plan if I'm gonna write anything on the Cup race because I'm racing with IMSA at Laguna Seca this weekend,
Mhm.
and both of the races are on Sunday. So I'll be following along with whatever interesting stuff happens in Cup, but probably at night. And then I
Yeah.
think the race might be what I watch on Sunday night,
How
at
about
the
a cup
airport.
race at Laguna? How about
Yeah,
that?
oh, that would be neat. Now
We
that
need
would
to
be
talk somebody
incredible.
into that. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's yeah, that's I think that would be incredible. If only it was in Southern California, it would probably be already be a done deal because I think that's
Yeah.
just the missing gap. But I am
Yeah. We're
looking
kind of
forward
too
to
close
that.
to Sonoma, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the tough part. But yeah, just trying to imagine a cup car coming, coming down the
On
corkscrew
the
and all that
corkscrew. Yeah.
is yeah, that would be intense. But so I'm looking forward to that. Got to fly out to California in a couple of days, but it'll be cool to see what happens in Kansas. There's some interesting stuff there. Got kind of couple of up and coming guys there with Jesse Love's racing again, and
Hmm.
then Corey Hines making his first Cup start of the year with 2311. So that
Pretty good
I'll be
place to do it, right? With
yeah,
with
yeah, for
2311. Yeah.
2311. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll,
Pretty
I'll
good
be
track.
curious to see how he compares to some of their full time guys with some of the stuff we just discussed with how the skills transfer and all that. So that'll be a fascinating race to watch, and I think should generally be a good race just because of how it's raced the last few
Yeah.
years. So it'll be cool, but I'll be I think it's 3 p.m. Eastern Sunday on NBC for the IMSA race. So you guys can catch me there if you're following along in the 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, and
Yeah.
then I'll be catching up on whatever happens in Kansas sometime early next week. Thank you for joining me, Joey.
Yeah. Thank you, Bozy. Thanks for having me.